They took turns calling me pathetic, lazy, a failure. My uncle said, she'll be nothing her whole life. I finally looked up and answered, funny, because I'm the only reason you're not homeless. The room went dead silent. My aunt whispered, what did you just say? But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now let's dive into today's story. The smell of burnt casserole hung in the air of the Whitaker house, mingling with the stale scent of carpet that hadn't been cleaned in months. Nina Whitaker sat on the far end of the sagging couch, her paper plate balanced carefully on her knees. The furniture groaned under the weight of Sunday evening, a ritual that had repeated itself every week for the past 10 years without fail. She'd learned not to use the table. That was for real adults, as Colleen had explained once, her voice clipped and final. Nina was 27 now, but in this house she remained frozen at 17, the girl who'd arrived with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a social worker's business card. Ray Whitaker sat in his recliner, the remote control resting on the arm like a scepter. He was a broad man who'd once been athletic but had softened into something heavier, more immovable. His voice filled the room even when he spoke quietly, which wasn't often. Tonight he was holding court, as he always did on Sundays. Some people just don't have ambition, Ray said, his eyes fixed on the television screen where a football game played on mute. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, but everyone knew who he meant. They're comfortable being carried, taking handouts, never building anything for themselves. Colleen nodded from the kitchen doorway, her thin lips pressed into that familiar line of disapproval. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel, the same faded blue one Nina had bought 3 years ago when the old ones had fallen apart. We gave you stability, Colleen added, her voice carrying that particular tone of martyrdom she wore like a second skin. That's more than most people get. Not everyone would have opened their home. Nina's cousin, Evan, sprawled in the armchair across from her, his phone casting a blue glow on his face. He was 32, still living in his childhood bedroom upstairs, still expecting his laundry to appear clean and folded on his bed. She's still here, so that tells you everything, he muttered without looking up. His thumb scrolled endlessly through whatever feed held his attention. Nina stayed quiet. She'd perfected the art of silence over the years, learned exactly how to make herself small and unremarkable. Silence had kept the peace. Silence had kept a roof over her head. Silence had meant one less thing for them to criticize, one less reason for Ray to start his lectures about gratitude and sacrifice. The casserole on her plate had gone cold. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her shoulders, the familiar sensation of being both present and invisible. Outside, a car drove past, its headlights briefly illuminating the water-stained ceiling before darkness settled back in. Ray set his beer down on the side table, the glass clinking against wood. He still hadn't looked at her, but his next words were aimed with precision. She'll never be anything. Too soft. No backbone. That's what happens when people don't have to fight for what they get. Something shifted in Nina's chest. A small thing at first, like a door opening in a room she'd kept locked for years. She lifted her head and looked directly at Ray for the first time that evening. I pay the mortgage, she said. Her voice came out even, neither loud nor soft, just clear. If I stop, you lose this house. The words hung in the air like smoke. No yelling, no shaking, no dramatic gesture, just a fact, stated plainly, the way someone might mention the weather or the time. The room stalled. The football game continued, playing on silent, the colors flickering across faces that had gone still. Evan's thumb stopped scrolling. Colleen's hand froze mid-wipe on the dish towel. Ray's entire body seemed to tense, his knuckles whitening as his grip tightened on the armrest. Colleen's whisper came first, thin and disbelieving. What did you just say? Nina didn't repeat herself. She simply held Ray's stare, watching as confusion flickered across his features, followed by something darker. She could see him trying to process it, trying to fit this version of her into the framework he'd built over the years. It didn't fit. The girl who never talked back, who absorbed every insult with bowed shoulders, didn't say things like that. But she had, and now there was no taking it back. The silence stretched longer. Nina stood slowly, setting her paper plate on the coffee table. The sound of the plate touching would seem impossibly loud. She walked to the stairs, her footsteps steady, feeling their eyes following her like spotlights. Behind her, she heard Ray finally move, heard the leather of his recliner creak as he shifted forward. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice had that edge to it now, the one that used to make her stomach clench with anxiety. Nina paused at the bottom of the stairs, but didn't turn around. "To my room." "We're not done talking." "Yes," she said quietly. "We are." She climbed the stairs without hurrying, without looking back. Each step felt like walking through deep water, requiring more effort than it should. But she didn't stop. When she reached her room, the smallest bedroom in the house, barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, she closed the door and sat on the edge of the mattress. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up to her body. She pressed them flat against her thighs and focused on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd taught herself during those first terrible months after her father's death. Through the thin walls, she could hear them downstairs, voices rising and falling, Ray's anger bleeding through, Colleen's sharper tones trying to make sense of what had just happened. Evan's voice joined in, defensive and confused. Nina looked around her small room. The walls were bare because she'd never been allowed to paint them. The closet held 3 work shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, and the black dress she'd worn to her father's funeral. Everything she owned could fit in 2 suitcases. She'd never accumulated more because some part of her had always known this was temporary, that this house wasn't home no matter how many years she spent inside its walls. The memory came unbidden, the way memories do when defenses are down. She'd been 17, standing in the social services office, when the caseworker had told her about Ray and Colleen. "Family placement is always best," the woman had said with a tired smile. "They've agreed to take you in. That's lucky. Most kids your age end up in group homes." Lucky. That word had followed her for 10 years. Nina moved in at 17. 3 weeks after her father's funeral. Her mother had disappeared 2 years before that, lost to addiction and the streets of Cincinnati. Her father had done his best, working double shifts at the plant, but the cancer had come fast and merciless. When he died, Nina had no one. Ray had shown up at the funeral in a dark suit that didn't quite fit, his expression serious. "Your family," he'd said, gripping her shoulder. "We take care of our own." What it meant, she learned quickly, was that she had value only in what she could provide. At 17, that meant babysitting Evan's 2 young children while Evan went out with friends. It meant cleaning bathrooms and doing laundry, cooking dinner when Colleen didn't feel like it, running errands because Ray's back hurt. "You're helping the family," Colleen would say. "Everyone contributes." But only Nina's contributions were mandatory. Only her time was considered communal property. At 19, she got her first real job, working the register at a drugstore on the edge of town. The pay wasn't much, but it was hers. She remembered the feeling of that first paycheck in her hands, the weight of possibility. She'd wanted to save it, to build something that would let her leave. Instead, Ray had come to her room one evening, his face grave. "We're a little short this month," he'd said. "The mortgage payment. If it's late, they charge fees. I hate to ask, but just this once." Just this once had turned into a pattern. By the time she was 21, covering payments had become routine. She'd moved up to assistant manager at the drugstore, then to a better job doing data entry for a medical billing company. More money meant more expectations. At 24, her bank account was linked to the mortgage payment. It came out automatically on the 1st of every month, smooth and inevitable as the seasons changing. $1,300, gone before she even saw it. Ray never asked how she managed. He just said, "Good. About time you earned your keep." Nina opened her laptop now, the screen's glow washing blue across her face. She pulled up her bank statements, something she did often lately, tracing the numbers back through years. The mortgage payments, the utility bills she'd covered when money was tight, the car insurance for a vehicle she didn't drive, the credit card payment for charges she didn't make. She'd kept records of everything without really understanding why. Some instinct for self-preservation, maybe. Some small voice that had whispered even then that she might need proof someday. Downstairs, the voices had quieted. The house had that particular quality of held breath, of people waiting to see what would happen next. Nina closed her laptop and lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling where a water stain spread like a map of somewhere she'd never been. The thing about being treated like nothing was that eventually you had nothing left to lose. That realization had been creeping up on her for months, maybe years. But tonight, standing in that living room with cold casserole on a paper plate, something had crystallized. If she was already nothing in their eyes, then what exactly was she protecting by staying silent? The answer was becoming clearer with each breath. Absolutely nothing at all. The next morning, Nina woke before dawn the way she always did. Her internal clock had been set by years of early shifts and household expectations that started before anyone else was awake. The house was quiet, that deep silence that only comes in the hours before sunrise. She dressed in the dark, pulling on her work clothes by muscle memory. In the kitchen, she made coffee in the old percolator, the smell cutting through the stale air. She stood at the counter, watching the liquid drip into the pot, and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd made coffee just for herself. There was always someone else who needed it first, someone whose time was more valuable. She poured a cup into her travel mug and left the rest for whoever woke next. Then she gathered her bag and keys and slipped out the front door before anyone else stirred. Work was the one place where Nina's competence was recognized without resentment. At Dayton Medical Billing Solutions, she processed insurance claims with an accuracy rate that made her supervisor smile during performance reviews. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady and she was good at it. Better than good. "Morning, Nina," called Tom from his cubicle as she settled into her chair. Tom was 56, had worked there for 15 years, and treated everyone with the same easy kindness. "You're in early." "Couldn't sleep," she replied, booting up her computer. He chuckled. "I hear that. My wife says I check work emails in my dreams." The routine of work was soothing. Nina pulled up her queue and began processing claims, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Medical codes, insurance verification, payment processing. It was all systematic, logical, free of emotional subtext. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't tell you that you were worthless while depending on your paycheck. At lunch, she sat in her car in the parking lot rather than the break room. She needed the quiet, needed space to think without small talk or the forced cheerfulness of workplace socializing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Colleen. "We need to talk when you get home." Nina stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it without responding. She knew what "we need to talk" meant. It meant Ray wanted an apology. It meant Colleen would try to smooth things over while making it clear that Nina had crossed a line. It meant the weight of their disappointment would be pressed down on her shoulders until she bent. But something had broken loose inside her. The machinery of compliance had finally seized up, its gears grinding to a halt. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew with sudden clarity that she wouldn't be apologizing. That evening, she didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove to the public library downtown, a brick building that had stood since the 1920s. Inside, it was quiet in a different way than the house, a peaceful quiet rather than a hostile one. She found a computer station in the back and began researching. Property records, credit reports, mortgage payment histories, consumer protection laws. She clicked through page after page, taking notes in a small notebook she'd bought from the dollar store. The picture that emerged was worse than she'd imagined. Ray's name was on the deed, but Nina's name appeared on multiple loan documents. Refinancing papers she vaguely remembered signing. Ray standing over her shoulder saying it was just a formality. Co-signing agreements for cars and credit cards that had nothing to do with her. Her credit score bore the marks of late payments and maxed-out limits, none of which she'd been aware of until now. He'd used her. Systematically, deliberately, he'd tangled her credit into his financial failures. And she'd let him because she'd trusted that family meant something other than exploitation. Nina sat back in the hard plastic chair, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the notebook. The betrayal was comprehensive. The anger that rose in her chest wasn't hot and explosive, but cold and clarifying. This was what Ray had meant by earning her keep. He'd been building a financial scaffolding around his own failures, and she'd been the unwitting foundation. She stayed at the library until closing time at 9, compiling her documentation. Every payment she'd made, every document she'd signed, every promise of just this once, or just until things stabilize. The paper trail was extensive because she'd always been methodical, always careful to keep receipts, even when she didn't fully understand why. When she finally drove home, the house was lit up, every window glowing yellow against the night. She sat in her car for a moment, gathering her strength before heading inside. They were waiting in the living room. All three of them, Ray in his recliner, Colleen on the couch, Evan standing by the doorway with his arms crossed. The staging was deliberate, designed to intimidate. An intervention. "You're late," Ray said. Nina set her bag down by the stairs. "I had errands." "We need to address what happened yesterday," Colleen began, her voice taking on that reasonable tone she used when she wanted to appear fair. "You said some things that were inappropriate, hurtful." Nina looked at her, really looked. Colleen was 53, her hair graying at the temples despite regular dye jobs. She wore her righteousness like armor, impenetrable and polished. She genuinely believed that providing shelter meant owning someone's dignity. "I stated a fact," Nina said. "If that's hurtful, maybe examine why." Ray's jaw tightened. "Don't get smart. You live here because we allow it. We've given you everything." "I pay for everything," Nina interrupted, and the sharpness in her voice surprised even her. "The mortgage, the utilities, half the groceries. I've been paying for years while you tell me I'm worthless." "That's not," Colleen started. "Do you know what my credit score is, Ray?" Nina pulled her notebook from her bag, flipped it open. 537. "Do you know why?" "Because you put my name on loans I didn't know about. Credit cards I never applied for. And when you didn't pay them, the debt followed me." The room went silent. Evan shifted uncomfortably, his bravado from the previous night nowhere in evidence. Ray's face had gone red, but beneath the color, something like panic flickered in his eyes. "That was temporary," he said. "I was going to fix." "When?" Nina's voice stayed level. "When were you going to fix it? After another year of telling me I'm nothing? After I've destroyed my credit completely?" Colleen stood up, her hands clasped in front of her. "Your family. Family helps each other. If you're upset, we can talk about this like adults." "I'm done talking." Nina closed her notebook. "I'm done covering for you. I'm done being useful." She started toward the stairs, but Ray's voice stopped her, hard and cold. "If you're not going to contribute, you can leave. Tonight." Nina turned back slowly. She'd known this moment would come, had felt it building since yesterday's dinner. But hearing it out loud still sent a jolt through her system, part fear and part liberation. "Fine," she said. The word hung there, simple and final. Ray's expression shifted, confusion replacing the anger. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. She was supposed to apologize, to back down, to resume her role. "Fine," he repeated. "I'll be out by the end of the month." Nina continued up the stairs, her legs steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Behind her, she heard Colleen's sharp intake of breath, heard Evan mutter something under his breath. In her room, she closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. 10 years of silence, broken in 2 days, and now there was no going back. Her phone buzzed. A text from Colleen. You don't mean that. Nina silenced her phone and began making a list of everything she needed to do. Find an apartment, redirect her mail, separate her finances completely from theirs, contact a lawyer about the credit situation. Each item felt both overwhelming and oddly simple. One task at a time, one step forward. Outside her window, the neighborhood was dark and quiet. The same streets she'd walked for 10 years. The same houses she'd watched through changing seasons. She'd felt trapped here, caught in amber, unable to imagine a way out. But she was imagining it now. And more than imagining, she was planning. The fear was still there, cold and insistent. But beneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt like possibility, like the first breath of air after being underwater too long. Nina pulled out her laptop and began searching for apartments in her price range. She had first and last month's rent saved, barely. It would be tight, especially while she dealt with the credit issues Ray had left her. But tight was manageable. Tight was survivable. And surviving on her own terms was better than living in comfort at the cost of her soul. The confrontation with Colleen came sooner than Nina expected. 2 days after her declaration to move out, she was sorting laundry in the basement, a dank space with exposed pipes and a concrete floor that stayed cold year-round, when she heard footsteps on the wooden stairs. Colleen descended slowly, each step deliberate, her slippers making soft, shuffling sounds against the wood. Nina didn't look up from the clothes she was folding, her work shirts pressed and neat. The motions were automatic, soothing in their familiarity. "You embarrassed Ray," Colleen said quietly, stopping at the bottom of the stairs. Her voice had lost its usual edge, replaced by something that might have been genuine hurt if Nina had still been capable of believing in Colleen's good intentions. "That was unnecessary. He's done everything for you." Nina kept folding, creasing the sleeves of her shirts with precision. "So was everything he said to me for 10 years. That's different." Colleen moved closer, her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold despite the heavy cardigan she wore. "This is family. You don't threaten family. You don't throw their difficulties in their faces." Nina looked up then, really meeting Colleen's eyes. They were blue-gray, watery behind her glasses. She looked older down here in the harsh fluorescent light, the lines around her mouth deeper than Nina remembered. "I didn't threaten anyone. I stated reality. You said you'd stop paying." Colleen's hands tightened on her cardigan. "You said we'd lose the house. If I stop paying, you will lose the house. That's not a threat. It's a fact." Colleen's mouth opened, closed. Her eyes flickered away, unable to hold the direct gaze. That's when Nina saw it clearly. The knowledge had always been there. Colleen knew exactly how much Nina contributed, knew that the house, the electricity, the stability they claimed to provide her, all of it rested on Nina's paycheck. "You wouldn't actually stop paying," Colleen said, but her voice wavered, turning it into a question. That was the moment Nina knew with absolute certainty. They thought she was bluffing. They thought that if they called her on it, applied enough guilt and pressure, she would cave. Because she always had before. Because the role she'd been assigned was the girl who absorbed punishment without complaint, who paid and never asked for anything in return. "Wouldn't I?" Nina set down the shirt she'd been folding. "You don't actually know me at all, do you?" Colleen flinched. "I know you're angry. You have a right to be angry. But walking away from family—" "What family?" The words came out harder than Nina intended, but she didn't soften them. "What exactly has this family given me besides a place to sleep and a list of reasons why I'm not good enough? We took you in. We didn't have to. You could have ended up in foster care, in some group home with strangers. Instead, you had family, people who knew your father, who used me. Nina's voice didn't rise, but it cut clean through Colleen's justifications. Who used my credit, my income, my time, and gave me nothing but contempt in return. Colleen's face had gone pale. That's not fair. Fair. Nina almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. You want to talk about fair? When's the last time someone in this house said thank you? When's the last time Ray spoke to me without an insult? When's the last time Evan cleaned up after himself instead of leaving it for me? Colleen was crying now, quiet tears sliding down her cheeks. It was a practice display, one Nina had seen many times. The tears were real, but they weren't about remorse. They were about the discomfort of being confronted, about having the family's carefully maintained fiction shattered. We're losing everything, Colleen whispered. If you leave, if you stop helping, then you'll figure it out. Nina picked up her laundry basket, her clean clothes neatly folded inside, the same way millions of people figure it out every day. She walked past Colleen toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard Colleen's voice, thin and desperate. Please, don't do this to us. Nina paused on the third step, her back to her aunt. For a moment, she considered turning around, considered explaining one more time why this wasn't cruelty, but survival. But Colleen wouldn't hear it. She'd only hear rejection, only see ingratitude, because acknowledging Nina's perspective would mean acknowledging their own guilt. So Nina just kept climbing, leaving Colleen in the basement with the dripping pipes and the cold concrete floor. Nina didn't announce her departure plans. She simply stopped fixing things. It started small. When Ray missed a payment deadline for the gas bill, Nina saw the notice arrive in the mail. In the past, she would have quietly paid it, avoiding the late fee and the confrontation. This time, she left the envelope on the kitchen counter unopened. 3 days later, Ray found it. Why didn't you handle this? He waved the envelope at her while she ate cereal at the counter, the only time she dared use the kitchen when others were around. Nina swallowed her bite, took her time. Handle what? The gas bill. It's late. There's a fee now. Then you should probably pay it. His face reddened. I thought you thought I'd keep covering for you without being asked? Nina rinsed her bowl in the sink, her movements calm and methodical. I thought you wanted me to grow up, take responsibility, not rely on handouts. The echo of his own words hung between them. Ray's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he turned and stormed out. Nina heard him in the living room, cursing as he searched for his checkbook, struggling with basic tasks he'd long ago delegated to others. The pattern continued. The power bill arrived with a past due notice. Nina left it untouched. Evan's car insurance payment bounced. Nina didn't cover it. The credit card statements piled up on the counter, red-stamped warnings of late fees and increasing interest. Colleen tried a different approach, catching Nina in the evening when she came home from work. Honey, I think some of the bills got mixed up. Can you help me sort through what's been paid? Nina didn't slow her pace to the stairs. I paid my share. Everything else is up to Ray. But I usually paid for things that weren't my responsibility. I'm done doing that. Each refusal felt like shedding weight, like removing stones she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten they weren't part of her body. But it wasn't easy. Years of conditioning didn't evaporate overnight. Every time she passed an unpaid bill, every time she heard Ray's frustrated muttering, every time she saw Colleen's worried face, part of her wanted to cave, wanted to smooth things over, make it easy, return to the familiar pattern where at least she knew her role. But she didn't. She kept a notebook now, documenting everything. Dates, amounts, text messages. Not for revenge. She told herself this every time she wrote something down, but for clarity. For proof that she wasn't crazy, that the gaslighting and guilt trips weren't reality. On Wednesday evening, she came home to find Ray sorting through a stack of papers at the dining room table, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded. "The bank called," he said. Nina set her purse down. "Okay. They're questioning some of the payments. Want documentation." He shuffled papers, avoiding her eyes. "I need you to come with me tomorrow. Explain the arrangement." "What arrangement?" The one where you help with the mortgage. They need to verify." "No." The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Ray's head snapped up. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I'm not going to the bank with you to verify an arrangement that was never clearly discussed or documented." Nina kept her voice even. "If they're questioning payments, that's between you and them." Ray stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This affects you too. Your name is on." "I know my name is on things it shouldn't be on." Nina met his stare. "I've been researching that. It's interesting what I've found." Something shifted in Ray's expression. Wariness, maybe, or the first hint of understanding that this wasn't a temporary rebellion. "You've been researching." "I have. Did you know that forging someone's signature on loan documents is fraud? That using someone else's credit without their full understanding and consent has legal ramifications?" "I didn't forge anything. You signed." "I signed what you told me to sign, when you told me it was routine paperwork. I was 19, Ray. I trusted you." Nina moved toward the stairs. "That trust is gone now. Whatever mess you've made with the bank, you'll have to untangle it yourself." "You ungrateful!" Ray started, his voice rising, but Nina was already climbing the stairs, her heart pounding but her steps steady. Behind her, she heard Evan's voice from the living room. "What's going on?" "Your cousin," Ray spat, "is trying to destroy this family." Nina closed her bedroom door on the rest of the conversation. She was shaking now, adrenaline coursing through her system. Each confrontation took something out of her, left her wrung out and exhausted. But each one also reinforced her resolve. There was no going back. The bridge wasn't just burning. It had already collapsed into ash. The real turning point came on a Saturday afternoon. Nina had been apartment hunting all morning, viewing small studios and one-bedrooms in her price range. Most were depressing. Dark spaces with suspicious stains and landlords who looked at her application with obvious skepticism. But she'd found one possibility, a small duplex near Yellow Springs, about 30 minutes away. It had hardwood floors that needed refinishing and windows that let in actual light. The landlord, an older woman named Patricia, had smiled when Nina explained she worked in medical billing. "Steady work," Patricia had said. "That's what I like to see." Nina had filled out the application right there, her hands only slightly unsteady as she wrote down her information. She'd been honest about her credit score, explaining briefly about the family situation. Patricia had listened without judgment, then nodded. "I'll run the check and let you know by Monday," she'd said. "But between you and me, I've seen plenty of young people rebuilding from family messes. You've got steady employment and good references. That counts for something." Nina had driven home feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Maybe this would actually work. Maybe she could actually get out. She arrived home to find Ray's truck in the driveway along with an unfamiliar sedan. Through the front window, she could see people in the living room. She hesitated before going inside, some instinct warning her that whatever was happening, it wouldn't be good. Inside, she found Ray sitting stiffly on the couch with Colleen beside him. Across from them sat a man in a cheap suit, a briefcase open on the coffee table. The man looked up when Nina entered, his expression professionally neutral. "You must be Nina," he said, standing to offer his hand. "I'm Douglas Brennan from First Ohio Credit Union." Nina shook his hand automatically, her mind racing. "Hello." "Doug's here about the refinancing," Ray said, his voice tight. I told him you'd be willing to help straighten out some confusion. Nina looked from Ray to the banker and back again. Confusion about what? Douglas consulted a document from his briefcase. We've been working with Mr. Whitaker on refinancing the home loan. During our review, we noticed several irregularities in the payment history and account documentation. Your name appears on multiple documents, but the payments have been inconsistent with what was agreed upon. Because I'm the one who's been making the payments, Nina said slowly, understanding dawning. Not Ray. Douglas nodded. That's part of what we need to verify. Mr. Whitaker indicated you were a co-borrower, but the original documentation is unclear. When we ran both credit reports, we found... He trailed off, his professional mask slipping slightly. Nina felt her stomach drop. What did you find? Your credit has significant derogatory marks. Late payments, collections, charge-offs, all associated with accounts bearing both your name and Mr. Whitaker's. The refinancing application was flagged because of the inconsistencies. Frankly, with your current credit profile, you wouldn't qualify as a co-borrower. The room spun slightly. Nina gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. How many accounts have my name on them? Douglas flipped through papers. 7 that we've identified so far. 2 credit cards, a car loan, a personal loan, and 3 store credit accounts. Most are in default or significantly past due. 7. Nina's mind reeled. 7 separate accounts she hadn't known existed, all dragging down her credit, all tying her to Ray's financial disasters. I didn't apply for any of those, she said, her voice coming from somewhere far away, except whatever mortgage paperwork Ray asked me to sign when I was younger. Douglas's expression shifted to something like sympathy. Do you have documentation of what you signed? No. He said it was routine. I trusted. Nina stopped, looked at Ray. He was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched, saying nothing. I trusted him. This is more complicated than a simple refinancing issue, Douglas said carefully. If there are questions about consent and proper disclosure, that ventures into legal territory that's beyond my scope. I came here today to verify the payment history and current arrangements, but what I'm hearing suggests there might be grounds for an unauthorized credit claim. She signed everything willingly, Ray burst out. I never forced her. She wanted to help the family. I was 19. Nina's voice cracked. You told me I was just co-signing so you could get better interest rates. You said it wouldn't affect my credit. You said you'd pay everything on time. I meant to. You meant to use me. You destroyed my credit while telling me I was worthless, while telling me I contributed nothing. Nina turned to Douglas. What do I need to do to separate myself from all of this? Douglas closed his briefcase slowly. You'll need to consult with a lawyer about the credit issues. I can't advise you on that. What I can tell you is that the refinancing application is denied. The property's current mortgage situation is precarious. He stood, nodding to Ray and Colleen. I'd recommend you speak with a housing counselor about your options. Soon. He left his card on the table and showed himself out. The front door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Colleen was crying again, her hands over her face. Evan had appeared in the doorway at some point, his expression shocked. Ray sat motionless, staring at nothing. Nina felt like she was watching the scene from outside her body. She knew she should feel something. Rage, betrayal, grief. But all she felt was a cold, crystalline clarity. 7 accounts, she said quietly. You ruined my credit with 7 accounts I didn't know about, while telling me every Sunday that I was nothing, that I'd never be anything. Ray finally looked at her. For a moment, she thought she saw remorse in his eyes. But then his jaw set, his familiar defensiveness rising. What did you do? He asked. The absurdity of the question almost made her laugh. What did I do? You went to them. You told them. I didn't tell them anything. I didn't have to. Your fraud speaks for itself. Nina moved toward the stairs, then stopped. She turned back, looking at all three of them. Ray with his defensive anger, Colleen with her performative tears, Evan with his uncomfortable silence. I want you to know something, she said. When I leave here, when I'm gone and you're struggling to figure out how to survive without my paycheck, I want you to remember that you did this. Not me. I would have kept paying. I would have kept quiet. I would have stayed in my role as the family burden who somehow paid all your bills. But you pushed. You kept pushing until I looked close enough to see what you'd really done to me. She headed upstairs, her steps echoing in the silence. Behind her, she heard Ray's voice, rough and defensive. She doesn't understand how hard. Shut up, Ray, Evan said quietly. Just shut up. Nina closed her bedroom door and leaned against it, her whole body shaking now. She pulled out her phone and Googled Consumer Protection Attorney Dayton, Ohio. The search returned several results. She bookmarked them all, then opened her notebook and began documenting everything Douglas had said, every detail she could remember. The fear was there, stronger than ever. 7 accounts. Her credit in ruins. Legal fees she couldn't afford. The overwhelming complexity of untangling herself from years of financial abuse. But beneath the fear, that cold clarity remained. She'd been afraid before, when her father died, when she'd arrived here at 17 with nothing. She'd survived that. She would survive this. And this time, she'd survive without sacrificing herself on the altar of other people's dysfunction. Nina moved out on a Tuesday morning in late September. The air had turned crisp overnight, carrying the first real hint of autumn. She loaded her belongings into her car in 3 trips. 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of books, her laptop bag, and a few kitchen items she'd bought with her own money over the years. Everything she owned fit easily in the trunk and back seat of her Honda Civic. No one came out to say goodbye. Ray's truck was gone. Colleen's car sat in the driveway with the curtains drawn, and Evan's bedroom window was dark. Nina didn't know if they were avoiding her or if they genuinely didn't care. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. She took one last look at the house before getting into her car. The siding needed repainting. The gutters sagged in places. The front lawn was patchy and brown. She'd spent 10 years inside those walls, and yet looking at it now felt like regarding a stranger's home. There was no nostalgia, no sense of loss. Just relief that she was finally leaving. The duplex near Yellow Springs was waiting for her. Patricia had called on Monday, just as promised, approving her application despite the credit issues. I checked your references, she'd said. Your supervisor at the medical billing company spoke very highly of you. Said you're reliable, honest, hardworking. That tells me more than a credit score. That's clearly not your fault. Nina had almost cried in gratitude. Almost. But she'd learned to keep her emotions contained, held close where they couldn't be used against her. The duplex was small, a 1-bedroom with a galley kitchen and a living room that doubled as a dining space. But it had those hardwood floors she'd noticed before, and windows that let in morning light, and a bathroom that was hers alone. The landlord's side of the building was separated by a thick wall, and Patricia had explained she was quiet, mostly kept to herself. It's not fancy, Patricia had said when Nina signed the lease, but it's clean and safe and I keep things maintained. If something breaks, I fix it. That's my promise to my tenants. Nina had signed without hesitation. Fancy wasn't what she needed. She needed peace. She needed distance. She needed a space where she could breathe without calculating the cost of each breath. Now, parking in the small driveway, she felt the weight of the past months finally beginning to lift. She carried her belongings inside, making multiple trips up the narrow steps to her front door. Each item placed in her new space felt like an act of reclamation. Her books on the empty shelves, her clothes in the small closet, her laptop set up on the second-hand desk she'd bought from a thrift store. By afternoon, she'd unpacked everything and stood in the center of her living room, surveying her new domain. It was sparse, almost empty, but it was hers. Every stick of furniture, every dish in the cupboard, every towel in the bathroom, all purchased by her, owned by her, arranged exactly how she wanted. She made herself lunch using the sandwich supplies she'd picked up at the grocery store on the way over. She ate standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the backyard where oak trees shed their first autumn leaves. The silence was profound, but it wasn't the hostile silence of the Whitaker house. This was peaceful silence, the kind that invited rest rather than demanded performance. Her phone stayed quiet. Part of her had expected them to call, to make one last attempt at bringing her back. But the hours passed with no messages, no missed calls. Maybe they were still in shock. Maybe they were already working on how to cover the bills without her. Maybe they simply didn't care. Nina wasn't sure which option hurt more, but she was learning not to let it matter. Their silence was just another form of proof that she'd never really been family, just a resource to be exploited. That evening, she drove into Yellow Springs proper, a small village of art galleries, coffee shops, and independent bookstores. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She walked along Xenia Avenue, peering into shop windows, breathing in the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke from someone's chimney. She stopped at a small cafe called the Dancing Tree and ordered a coffee, a real one, not the instant kind Ray bought in bulk. She sat at a window table and watched people pass by, a couple walking hand in hand, a group of college students laughing, an elderly man walking a small terrier. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of other people's expectations. Her phone buzzed. For a moment, her heart jumped, but it was just a notification from her bank. Her automatic mortgage payment had been declined. She'd canceled the automatic transfer the day after the meeting with Douglas. The cancellation notification had arrived with a note. "We're sorry to see you cancel this recurring payment." To ensure uninterrupted service, she deleted it without finishing. Now, sitting in this cafe with good coffee and the amber light of evening streaming through the windows, she felt the reality of what she'd done settle over her. They would get a late notice, then another, then a default warning. Eventually, they'd lose the house, just as she'd told them they would, and she felt no guilt about it. That realization was startling in its completeness. She'd expected some residual sense of obligation, some nagging voice telling her she should help just one more time. But there was nothing, just the satisfaction of finally allowing reality to have its say. 2 weeks passed. Nina fell into a new routine. She woke up when her body felt rested rather than when obligation demanded. She made breakfast in her small kitchen, eating at her own pace, without performance or judgment. She drove to work listening to music instead of silence. She came home to an empty apartment that stayed exactly how she left it. She met with a consumer protection attorney named Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her 40s who specialized in cases of financial abuse. Jennifer had reviewed the documentation Nina brought, all her careful records, the account statements, the credit reports. "You have a strong case," Jennifer had said, her expression serious. What he did was textbook financial exploitation, using your identity and credit without full disclosure, especially given the power dynamic of the family situation. That's actionable. "How long will it take?" Nina had asked. "Months, maybe a year. These things move slowly, but we can start disputing the accounts, demonstrating fraud, rebuilding your credit. It won't be fast, but it's doable." Nina had signed the retainer agreement that same day. The legal fees would strain her budget, but she'd figure it out. She always did. At work, Tom had noticed a change in her demeanor. "You seem lighter," he'd said one day at lunch. "Good kind of lighter, I mean. Like you're not carrying the world anymore." "I moved out of my family's place," Nina had explained. "Got my own apartment." Tom had smiled knowingly. Family can be the hardest thing to get distance from. Good for you. She'd appreciated his lack of probing questions, his acceptance of her simple explanation. Not everyone needed to know the full story. The details were hers to hold or share as she saw fit. The phone call came on a Thursday evening in mid-October. Nina was making dinner, just pasta with Jared sauce, nothing fancy, when her phone lit up with Colleen's number. She stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Hello." "Nina." Colleen's voice was thin, strained. "We're losing the house." Nina kept stirring her pasta, watching the water bubble and steam. "I know. You know." Disbelief colored Colleen's tone. "You know, and you're just what? Going to let it happen. It's not my responsibility to stop it." "How can you say that, after everything we did for me?" Nina finished. "Is that what you were going to say? After everything you did for me?" Silence on the other end. Nina could hear background noise. The television. Ray's voice muttering something. The familiar sounds of that house that was no longer her concern. "You could help," Colleen said finally, and now her voice was pleading. "Just this once. Just to get us through. We're family, Nina. Family doesn't abandon each other." Nina turned off the stove, moved her pot to a cool burner. She walked to her living room window, looking out at the darkening street, the oak trees now mostly bare of leaves. "I already helped," she said quietly. "For 10 years I helped. I paid your mortgage, your bills, your late fees. I absorbed your insults, your dismissal, your contempt. I let Ray destroy my credit while telling me I was nothing. So no, Colleen, I won't help just this once. There's no just this once. There's just the pattern I'm finally breaking. We didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Nina's voice stayed steady, almost gentle. "You meant every word, every insult, every dismissal, every way you made me feel like I was a burden while simultaneously relying on my paycheck. You meant it all because it kept me in place. It kept me useful without having to treat me like a person." Colleen was crying now, real tears from the sound of it. "We're going to lose everything. Then you'll understand how I felt at 17 when I lost everything. The difference is you created this situation. I was just a kid whose father died. Nina, please. I need to go. My pasta's ready. You can't just—" "Goodbye, Colleen." Nina ended the call and stood there for a moment, her phone warm in her hand. She waited for the guilt to come, the remorse, the second-guessing. But there was only a deep, bone-settled certainty that she'd done the right thing. She blocked Colleen's number, then Ray's, then Evan's. 3 quick movements, and the last threads connecting her to that life were severed. She went back to the kitchen, drained her pasta, added sauce. She ate sitting on her second-hand couch, watching a documentary about ocean ecosystems, her plate balanced on her knees, just like it used to be in their living room. But this time, no one was there to insult her. No one was there to take inventory of her worth. No one was there at all, and that was exactly how she wanted it. 3 months later, on a cold January afternoon, Nina received the notification. Ray and Colleen had lost the house to foreclosure. The news came through a local real estate listing she'd been monitoring out of morbid curiosity. The property was listed as bank-owned, available for short sale. She looked at the listing photos, the same water-stained ceiling, the same sagging furniture, the same worn carpet. It looked smaller somehow, diminished. Or maybe she had grown larger in perspective, no longer seeing it through the eyes of someone trapped inside. She'd heard through a co-worker who knew someone in the neighborhood that Ray and Colleen had moved into a small rental on the other side of Dayton. A 2-bedroom apartment in a complex known for thin walls and strict noise ordinances. Evan had finally moved out, gotten a place with roommates, though apparently he was struggling with having to actually pay rent and buy his own groceries. No apology had come. Nina hadn't expected one. People like Ray and Colleen didn't apologize because they didn't see themselves as wrong. In their narrative, they were the victims of an ungrateful relative who'd abandoned them in their time of need. They would tell that story to anyone who would listen, painting themselves as martyrs and Nina as the villain. She was fine with that. Let them have their story. She had the truth, and more importantly, she had her freedom. The credit repair was progressing. Jennifer had successfully disputed 3 of the 7 accounts, demonstrating fraud through the lack of proper disclosure and the circumstances of her age when the documents were signed. The other 4 would take longer, but the trajectory was positive. Nina's credit score had already risen by 40 points. Not enough to qualify for much yet, but moving in the right direction. She'd been promoted at work to senior claims processor, with a raise that made breathing a little easier. Tom had retired, and at his farewell party he'd pulled Nina aside. "You did good, kid," he'd said. "Whatever you were dealing with before, you handled it. I'm proud of you." She'd thanked him, genuinely touched. It occurred to her that Tom's casual kindness over the years had been more familial than anything she'd experienced at the Whitaker house. Now, in her duplex on a Saturday morning, Nina sat at her small kitchen table with her coffee and her laptop. She was researching online courses, maybe accounting, maybe business management, something to build toward the future instead of being trapped by the past. Outside, fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the oak trees in white. The world looked clean, new, full of possibility. Patricia had already cleared the driveway and the walkway, her usual early morning efficiency. Nina's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. "This is Evan. Mom gave me your new number. I wanted to say I'm sorry for not standing up for you, for being part of the problem. You didn't deserve any of it. I hope you're doing okay." Nina stared at the message for a long time. Part of her wanted to respond, to acknowledge the apology, to leave some door open. But she knew better. Evan's apology, while perhaps genuine, didn't obligate her to anything. She'd learned that lesson well. Other people's regret wasn't her responsibility to manage. She deleted the message without responding and blocked the number. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. She returned to her research, scrolling through course catalogs, imagining futures. She thought about going back to school, maybe getting a degree. She thought about traveling, seeing parts of the country she'd only read about. She thought about all the Sundays ahead of her. Sundays without paper plates and insults, without performing gratitude for abuse, without the weight of others' expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She'd won, though not in any dramatic fashion. There had been no courtroom confrontation, no tearful reconciliation, no moment where they suddenly understood and apologized. Real life rarely worked that way. Instead, she'd won quietly by simply refusing to continue the pattern, by choosing herself over their dysfunction, by walking away and staying away. The victory wasn't loud, but it was complete. Nina finished her coffee and opened a document on her laptop. She'd been thinking about writing lately, maybe turning her experience into something that could help others in similar situations. A guide, perhaps, for people trapped in family dynamics that demanded they sacrifice themselves for others' comfort. She titled the document, "How to Stop Being Useful." Then she began to write, her fingers moving across the keyboard with confidence, telling her story in her own words, on her own terms. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering everything in white. The past fading under layers of new snow, becoming something distant and small. Inside her warm apartment, Nina worked, unburdened, unafraid, and finally unmistakably free. She'd stopped paying, not just in money, but in dignity, in self-worth, in the cost of her own soul. And in that stopping, she'd found something far more valuable than their approval or acceptance. She'd found herself, and that was worth more than any mortgage payment, any family obligation, any false sense of belonging. She'd stopped paying, and in doing so, she'd finally become whole.